Mr. Hippo. This purple hippopotamus animatronic was first introduced in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, but really made a name for himself in the following FNaF game, Ultimate Custom Night. I'm sure that you are just as well aware of Mr. Hippo's presence in FNaF meme culture as I am, since he is one of the easiest characters to survive in UCN, yet also has one of the most punishing game overs in the series. A uniquely drawn out post-jumpscare voice line, where instead of dipping after a creepy, odd, or interesting one-liner, this fella practically tells us his whole life story. But in terms of the fandom's memory of him, did we ever stop to consider the meaning of his messages in the first place? Or do we only recall how ridiculous it was that you had to sit through one of 4 lectures for over 2.5 minutes? Greetings and welcome to Continuity Error. My name is Matt, and today I will be discussing what I think is a very overlooked part of FNaF, the fables of the old purple animatronic, Mr. Hippo, and his stories. Mr. Hippo is unironically one of my favorite characters in this whole franchise. Not only is his design, his game mechanic, the fantastic voice acting unique, not only is he, like the rest of the Melodies, a much needed break from the endless, repeating variants of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, but he also provides some of the most thought-provoking lore, or should I say meta lore, in all of FNaF. Don't be fooled. His ramblings aren't complete nonsense, nor are they pretentious pseudo-philosophical essays. No. Mr. Hippo's stories are some genuinely interesting remarks on storytelling itself and metaphors for Scott's personal struggles with the FNaF lore throughout history. They are messages to us from him that have been reiterated again and again through Reddit posts and even a scrapped Fazbear Fright story. And yet, I'm not sure whether we really understand or should even agree with everything that he's saying. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In this video, I'm going to play clips of all 4 of Mr. Hippo's stories, one by one, and between each one I will analyze and explain my interpretation of what I think they mean. But if you have alternative interpretations that are different, let me know in the comments below, and then at the end of the video I'll do a full evaluation and kind of summary of the 4 stories, and just some personal thoughts and comments on why I think they're so important to this day, especially in regards to the FNaF franchise. So let's get started.
It seems that you have met your end. What a pity. You know, I don't feel too bad about it, though. After all, if it weren't me, it would have just been one of the others, I guess. I'm honestly just glad to be out of those air ducts. You know, it's not easy for a hippopotamus to fit up there, and not easy to get down either, and not as young as I used to be, as you can see. I used to be able to do all the sorts of things. You're young, you're vibrant, you have that sort of pep in your step. It reminds me of a conversation I was having with one of my good friends, Orville. We were having a nice picnic one day. I believe it was summer. No, perhaps it was... Was it the fall? Yes, it was the fall because the leaves had turned already. But I said to Orville, I says, "Orville, I have a story to tell you." And Orville looked at me, kind of odd, and said, "What's it about?" I said to him, "Not every story has to be about something, Orville. Sometimes a person just wants to talk. Why does everything have to be a story?" I said to him. He just looked at me and he said, "Well, you said you had a story." And, he was quite right. I did, in fact. I told him I had a story. I suppose if a person just wants to talk, then it's best to not announce that you're telling a story. Telling a story does come with its own pressures and expectations, I suppose. After all, if you're just talking to a friend, then there's no more expectations than if you were talking into the wind. Words by themselves aren't expected to carry, aren't expected to stick. But if you announce you're telling a story, well then, there'd better be a point to it all, No one wants to sit and listen to someone ramble on and on and on with absolutely no end in sight. So, it's good to be mindful that when you tell someone that you're about to tell a story, that you have something to say. Telling someone that you're going to tell them a story is tantamount to asking them to stop what they're doing and pay attention. You're basically saying, hey, Hey, buddy, stop everything. Stop what you're thinking. I have a solution to everything. And, well, I didn't really have any story to tell. In hindsight, I probably just misspoke when I said that I had a story. I think it would have just been better to tell Orville that I wanted to tell him something rather than tell him that I had a story. But, even then, it might have put too much importance on the whole thing. Either way, it was quite a nice day. I remember that we were drinking tea.
This first story has what is probably the simplest message of the four. As with every one of his game over voice lines, Mr. Hippo begins with ramblings about how unfortunate our situation is, how he is old and we are dead, inevitably being reminded of one of his many conversations with his good friend Orville. The main point of this story is pretty clear. Idle chatter with friends doesn't come with expectations and pressures, but full-on stories do. If you announce that you have an entire story to tell, it better be worth it, or you've wasted the time and energy of all those expectant listeners putting aside what they're doing just to hear what you have to say. Getting the two mixed up, intentionally or not, can be seen as rude. So if you announce what you're going to say, like it's this big thing, it really should have meaning or value in some capacity. Otherwise, what's the point? What's the point of a story if it doesn't have a moral, a lesson, a demonstration of society or the human condition? If it doesn't make us feel, laugh, or cry? If this is an organized narrative rather than just some casual conversation, then the effort put in by both tellers and listeners should be rewarding for all. Of course, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Mr. Hippo even says word for word that I didn't really have any story to tell. Just like with Hippo announcing his story to Orville, Scott Cawthon back in the early days effectively announced that he had a story to the FNaF fandom by putting lots of mysterious lore elements into the game. The reason I think this is because FNaF started off without a story. By introducing characters and events like Phone Guy, the missing children's incident, the bite of 87, etc., Scott put emphasis, perhaps wrongly, on the lore and narrative elements in Five Nights at Freddy's without actually telling any kind of cohesive plot. FNaF has no main character, it barely has an arc for its main villain. It didn't really have core themes. After the fandom responded to those elements by publishing numerous theories on social media, Scott continued to encourage this examination of FNaF's narrative elements with more hints to the in-universe events in sequels, even when in actuality, he was making it up as he went along. FNaFs 1, 2, and 3 contained connected historical events in a fictional universe, but no deeply characterized personalities, nor any meaning or morals to any of it. Events just happened to serve the gameplay. Characters were just caricatures, which existed to create a conflict. There was really no point to it all. And while Scott eventually worked around trying to change this, introducing actual characters with dialogue in Five Nights at Freddy's 4, voice acting and actual character interactions in Sister Location, with actual themes tying everything together by Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, even with the addition of the novel trilogy, by that time the story had a multitude of other issues, even if somewhat nuanced and developed characters with agendas and morals did now exist in FNaF's plot. The bottom line is, Scott didn't have a story to tell. FNaF doesn't really have a core message, and while it could be argued now with the additions of 4, Sister Location, and Pizza Sim, the story is about consequences or redemption, Scott miscommunicated the significance of FNaF's lore early on and had to try and give it some value and meaning retroactively to make it all worthwhile for us. Did it work? Moral of the story. A story means more than just talking to someone. If you're gonna tell a story, then make sure you've got something to say.
Well, it seems that your journey has ended. Very sorry about that. It was always going to end this way, of course. If it weren't by me, it would have just been by some other, terrible thing. Just, you could not imagine how terrible it would be. Just, I get scared thinking about it. I'm glad it's not me. It reminds me of a time I was speaking to my good friend Orville. We were sitting on a park bench watching the pigeons. I was on the left, he was on the... Oh, wait, was I on the right or left? Anyways, it doesn't matter. We were sitting on there watching the pigeons. And I said to Orville, "Friend, those birds are frozen." And he kind of looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But I reminded him that it was winter, and often birds will sit in a tree until they freeze. And then they sort of fall to the ground until the sun warms up and they can, move around again. So I said to Orville, you might as well save those breadcrumbs until the birds thaw, because they can't very well enjoy them in the condition they're in. To which he asked what I meant, and asking what condition the crumbs should be in before he threw them to the birds, assuming that I meant the birds couldn't enjoy the breadcrumbs in the condition that the crumbs were in, when in fact I had meant the birds could not enjoy them in the condition that the birds were in, considering that the birds were frozen. So he took a moment and then threw his last handful onto the ground. I said to him, Orville, why did you throw the breadcrumbs to the birds when I just told you they're frozen? To which he responded, the breadcrumbs are not frozen. Again, misunderstanding my words. I didn't mean to say that the breadcrumbs were frozen when I said I told you they're frozen. I'd been referring to the birds. In hindsight, what I should have said was, and this would make perfect sense, why did you throw the breadcrumbs to the birds when the birds are frozen? He misunderstood upon my correction, stating that he didn't know what else to do with the breadcrumbs, and that perhaps, when the birds thawed, they'd still be able to eat the crumbs. So I said to Orville, and this is what I said to him, I said, Orville, the birds may be dead.
The message of this story all fixates on miscommunication. Miscommunication is one of the most common reasons for conflict or confusion of any kind or scale, and any longtime FNAFer will know that this franchise deals with that a lot. Just to add to the oncoming confusion, I have not one, but two interpretations of the story, so do tell me which one you think to be more plausible, or if you have any other ideas. In this story, Mr. Hippo refers to the birds being in the wrong conditions to enjoy the breadcrumbs, which Orville misinterprets as the breadcrumbs being in the wrong conditions for the birds to enjoy. The issue is with the birds and not the breadcrumbs, but because Hippo didn't specify what he meant by using they, Orville thought he meant that the issue was with the breadcrumbs, not the birds. Considering that this released in 2018, it's possible that this story is not only a general statement from Scott, but actually references specific real-world events. If Mr. Hippo still represents Scott here and Orville the FNAF fandom, perhaps the birds represent FNAF's plot points and mysteries, and the breadcrumbs, theories, and solutions to said mysteries. The story is set in the winter of 2017 perhaps, shortly before theory fodder peaked with the releases of Pizzeria Simulator, the game made to help wrap up the lore, or The Logbook, the most confusing source of lore ever, in December, or the winter of 2016, immediately after Sister Location and its custom night update in December, where fans were left very confused by the new revelations and implications for all of the previous games. Either way, in a time of confusion for the story, the established narrative, represented by the birds, is frozen. It's not moving. It's not going to unfreeze or progress until the next game release, which took a longer time than previous games. Mr. Hippo, Scott, miscommunicates that there is an issue with the breadcrumbs, the theories of the FNAF story, being thrown by Orville, the fan/theorists, when in fact the issue is with the birds, the story. Despite correcting fans after they threw theories at an incomplete story, fans continued to do the same thing, tossing breadcrumb theories to a frozen plot. As fans argued that predicted theories might work when newer content is released, hence Orville in the story saying that the birds might be able to eat the bread after they had thawed, but Hippo declares that the birds are dead. Maybe this is a metaphor for Scott dropping past plot points and ideas, leaving them to be forgotten or even retconned. It could refer to the death of Dream Theory, Mic Trap, the contents of the box changing. Scott has made a few Reddit posts that might fit this, notably the one retcon post from mid-2017, or perhaps it's even a remark about the story ending, Reed dying. The content of the box changing was something brought up again in the 2018 interview with Dorco, just weeks after UCN's release.
But I'll tell you, he did a video on that box, and he kind of said that he thinks the contents of the box changed over the years. And I bet nobody gave that a whole lot of thought, but I saw that and I was like, he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right. The contents of that box have changed over the years.
All of these elements do fit the time frame. After all, wouldn't it be totally insane for FNAF to somehow try and continue the same narrative? Of course, it would be positively bonkers to somehow force those characters and ideas to stay alive and come back for the sake of fan service. Of course, I'm kidding. Of course, Scott would never do that. Okay, maybe I'm wrong? Let's say that Mr. Hippo is still Scott, but Orville instead now represents FNaF itself, the games, the books, etc. The birds are the FNaF fans / theorists, and the breadcrumbs are Scott's story lore in the games. Scott tries to communicate through his games that the issue is with his telling of the story, not the theories fans are creating for it. The games don't translate this well, however, and as a result keep throwing out breadcrumbs of information that confuse and seem to contradict. This doesn't help the fans, frozen in the confusion of the previous game, still trying to work out the pre-existing lore before being able to enjoy the new lore. And so what if the games imply that the new information will be enjoyed in time when the confusion is cleared up, when the birds unfreeze? Maybe it was how FNaF 4 wasn't a dream anymore, or how FNaF 4 was actually a dream all along, or the confusion between Mike and William Afton, or whatever, but all that matters is that the birds died. The FNaF fans left the fandom. Theorists and non-theorists alike, frustrated with the now incoherent lore and story that twisted the very thing they joined for into something too convoluted to enjoy, combined with a total lack of game news for months, and possibly even a dislike for what FNaF 4 Sister Location was, died back in 17, in the sense that the part of them invested in Five Nights at Freddy's simply ceased to exist. Even some who stayed, notably Markiplier, one of many FNAFers who has never read the books or delved into the lore whatsoever, has been notably distanced from FNAF since Sister Location. As time went on and a change of pace was established, FNAF's mainstream presence and appeal sank. I don't think I can confidently say it has returned to those levels since, even if on the surface there have been game releases which have drawn mainstream attention back to the franchise momentarily. Something I am curious about is whether anyone left FNAF and actually came back much later and stuck around to this day. So, Scott Cawthon miscommunicating FNAF's story in one way or another, with the games and books throwing out clues about the in-universe events, or the theorists throwing theories to an unfinished story, or both. Maybe both of these interpretations work simultaneously. Either way, it's a fact that FNAF stood still for a long time, and that a notable number of fans did leave in that time. Moral of the story? Miscommunication creates confusion and issues for stories and their respective fandoms. Even when cleared up, it can linger. Patience is a virtue, but there will always be people who lose interest in it all, however few of them that may really be.
My friend, you have met a terrible, terrible demise. But, I don't feel too bad about it. After all, if it weren't from me, it would have just been from someone else, I guess what I'm trying to say is life goes on. Well, for everyone else, life goes on, not for you. You're dead. But that's neither here nor there. It reminds me of one summer day in the park. I was having just a delightful picnic with my good friend Orville. And I said to him, Orville, I have a story. And he said to me, what's the significance of the story? And I said to him, Orville, not every story has to have significance, Sometimes, sometimes a story is just a story. If you try to read into every little thing and find meaning in everything anyone says, you'll just drive yourself crazy. I had a friend do it once. Wasn't pretty. We talked about it for years. And not only that, but you'll likely end up believing something you shouldn't believe, and thinking something you shouldn't think, or assuming something you shouldn't assume, Sometimes, I said, a story is just a story. So just be quiet for 1 second of your life and eat your sandwich, okay? Of course, it was only then I realized I'd made sandwiches, and poor Orville was having such difficulty eating it. Elephants have those clumsy hands, Actually, I suppose that's the problem. They don't have hands at all, do they? They're all feet. I couldn't imagine someone asking me to eat a sandwich with my feet. Now, if I recall correctly, there was a bakery nearby. I said to him, Orville, let me go get you some rye bread. Now, I'm unsure if elephants enjoy rye bread, but I assure you that Orville does. Now, this was on a Tuesday, which was good because rye bread was always fresh on Tuesday. They made sourdough bread on Monday and threw it out Wednesday, or rather, they sold it at a discount for people wanting to feed the ducks, and then probably at the end of the day, finally, they threw it all out. I don't recall. I do remember a man who would bring his son to the bakery every Wednesday, and then go feed the ducks. He would buy all of the sourdough bread. Of course, you're not supposed to feed the ducks sourdough bread at all. It swells up in their stomach and then they all die. At least that's what I've heard. I never saw any ducks die myself, but I did notice a substantial decrease in the duck population over the course of a few years. I just never thought to stop the man and tell him that he was killing the ducks by feeding them sourdough bread. And if you want my opinion on the matter, and I told Orville this as well, if you want to feed ducks, or birds, or any kind for that matter, it's best to buy seed. I mean, when you think about it, breads of any sort don't occur in nature. They don't grow on trees or spring up from the bushes. I don't think birds know what to do with bread. What was I saying? Oh, yes. So I bought Orville some rye bread. What a fine day it was.
In what is by far the longest and the most packed story, Mr. Hippo makes several points. There are really two separate halves to this story, so I'm going to examine each separately. First of all, there is a repeated emphasis on the idea that a story is just a story, and points reiterating that not everything has to mean something. If we interpret this as Scott talking about FNaF's story, it's pretty clear that he doesn't want us to overthink and overanalyze every little detail. And yes, that's exactly what we've had to do just to get to this point. I'm literally digging into every little line of dialogue just to hear Mr. Hippo tell me not to do that exact thing. So, well played, Scott. Very clever. The friend mentioned by Hippo might even be a direct reference to Matthew Patrick. This aligns with the 2018 post-UCN interview where Scott describes the back and forth he and MatPat had with the game theorists producing theories trying to solve FNaF's mysteries, and the FNaF games themselves either confirming or debunking said mysteries.
I watch all the game theory videos, and me and MatPat have sometimes had an antagonistic relationship back and forth. I inconvenience him with my games, and sometimes he inconveniences me with his theories, but it's all in good fun.
In fact, something else that this whole idea aligns with is a scrapped Fazbear Fright story called The Scoop. Shockingly, it was published recently in April 2022, almost 4 years after UCN and Mr. Hippo's stories, although this may have been written as early as 2019, we don't know. This meta story, written by Scott Cawthon himself, and Scott Cawthon alone, follows a FNaF fan trying to solve an actual mystery in the game files of FNaF 3 with a paranormal twist. All you need to know is this though. The line emphasized at the end of the story, spoken by the protagonist, is, quote, "The only thing I am certain of is, if the creator wanted us to know, I think he would tell us." So, is there something Scott has been trying to tell us this whole time? Why has this idea cropped up again so much time later? In fact, it's as if since FFPS, he's been actively trying to diminish the relevance of lore and story in FNaF, almost as if it's on purpose. Moving on to the second half of the story, Mr. Hippo tells us about how Orville struggles to eat sandwiches. I'm not sure what this could mean, if anything. It might just exist to make Mr. Hippo's narrative make sense. And the local bakery's breads, rye bread, which Orville likes, and sourdough bread, which is bad for ducks since it swells up in their stomachs and kills them. There are a lot of things this could mean. A man and his son feeding the ducks sourdough bread might be Scott and his child, FNaF, pushing away fans with poorly told stories, as explained earlier, or storytellers in general killing their audiences with stories that don't last long, that don't compel them to stay, and don't leave much to the imagination. If sourdough bread represents those kind of simple, forgettable stories, then the seeded bread that Mr. Hippo, who as always might represent Scott himself, says is best, would be good mysteries, like FNaFs that allow for interpretation and creativity, almost letting the reader write the story. Is that not one of the things that has kept FNaF so strong for so many years, despite numerous flaws? Are the best stories not the ones that allow for imagination to fill in the blanks, rather than overloading the reader with every last detail and no room for headcanon or continual pondering of the possibilities as time goes on? Lastly, we're given the point that birds don't know what to do with bread. Perhaps this simply means that us FNAFers, gamers, readers, etc., we don't know what to do with the obscure and confusing clues regarding the lore of FNaF. We fixate on trying to solve it when we're really supposed to fill in the blanks with our own imagination. Whether or not you agree with these arguments, whether you lean more towards the opinion that FNAF's mystery stories are too vague and thus ineffective, or actually agree that FNaF does a good job of telling a mystery story and planting seeds in our imagination, there is plenty to be said about this story. It would seem to me that perhaps Scott is saying here that mystery stories are good, but they don't have to be significant or meaningful. Maybe the two halves of the allegory aren't connected, though. Maybe I've misinterpreted them, or maybe there wasn't quite so much meaning in the details as one might think. Moral of the story? Don't feed birds bread. Seriously, I did some research, and even seeded bread can harm them. It's like candy is to us, for them, rare treats only.
It seems that you have met a horrible demise, my friend. But, these things happen in life. Life goes on. Not for you, obviously. You're dead. But it reminds me of a time I was having a conversation with my friend Orville. We were, where were we? I think we were by the river. We were sitting by the river and watching the fish leap over the falls. And I said to Orville, sometimes I feel like a fish leaping over and over again, always trying to get somewhere, though I don't know where, only to find myself in the jaws of a beast. He, of course, looked at me, surprised, Have you been in the jaws of a beast, friend? To which I said, no, of course not, Orville. I said, no. I simply meant that life can seem like a relentless endeavor to overcome meaningless obstacles, only to meet an equally meaningless fate, regardless of your efforts, regardless of the obstacles you've passed. And Orville, he stood and proceeded to drape me with a picnic cloth, to which I asked him, I said, friend, what are you doing? He looked at me very concerned, really. I feel like you've gotten too much sun. Indeed, indeed I had. He proceeded to pour me a glass of just ice-cold lemonade. Ooh, you ever mix it with iced tea? You do like a little half lemonade, half... Ooh, it's so... You should try it some... Well, you can't because you're dead. But anyways, so you may be asking yourself, how did I go from sitting by the falls and drinking lemonade to being wedged in the air duct? Not only with Orville, but with an entire assortment of fruity-colored friends. Well, there's really no good answer to that, but perhaps I met a demise of my own at some point, and this is my afterlife or my dream, whatever it might mean. I honestly don't know. Or maybe it doesn't mean anything at all. Maybe it doesn't mean anything at all.
This story focuses on Mr. Hippo himself, rather than the random situations he's been in. I am sure that he represents Scott, and I'm sure that he, like all of us, has felt at times how meaningless his struggles can seem, and how, regardless of whatever obstacles there were on the path, life truly can seem to be a relentless endeavor for nothing. Orville misunderstands his metaphor, taking him literally, but in shielding him from the sun, also demonstrates care for his friend, even if he clearly thinks all of his ramblings are nonsense induced by overheating. I feel like he again represents us, the FNaF fans. Regardless, Hippo has one last thing to say when confronting how he got from a picnic to an afterlife or dream, whatever UCN is, ending his ramblings with the iconic line, maybe it doesn't mean anything at all. The way I interpreted this was Scott admitting that maybe none of this means anything. Any of this could have just been meaningless rambling, but it also does in fact reinforce some of his original points. FNAF's story, its lore, it doesn't have to mean anything. Not every last little detail has importance, not everything has significance. Moral of the story, don't overthink it all. It doesn't all have meaning. Life can seem like a needless fight, but sometimes our minds can spiral into a philosophical hole of dark imagination, and sometimes we need a friend to pull us back to reality, even if they don't understand or agree with everything that we're rambling about. And with that, allow me to summarize what I've concluded about what these 4 stories really mean and what each of their core messages are. The T story demonstrates that Scott just wanted to make some games, but his presentation of FNAF's lore elements put pressure on him to tell a good story. Take the advice, fellas. If you announce you've got a story to tell, make sure it's something good. The Bird story shows that Scott miscommunicated FNAF's story, and despite attempts to clarify and repair it, confusion in the fandom has persisted. It's best to just avoid that kind of miscommunication in the first place, but if it comes down to it, you just gotta do the best you can and cut your losses. The Lemonade story illuminates some of Scott's deeper thoughts. He feels like life can be a relentless endeavor, And despite his greater and greater efforts to clarify the issues of the story, the FNaF fans continually misinterpret everything. Of course, the blame is also partly his, as even in regards to his own messages via Mr Hippo or otherwise, not everything has to mean something. Some things mean absolutely nothing at all. And that would be the end of the video, but I have a few more things to touch on, so let's extend this. While I do respect everything Scott has to say here, and certainly agree with a lot of the stories, there are a few things I feel need to criticize and challenge. I agree that Scott announced that he had a story to tell when there was indeed none. His repeated choices to encourage theory crafting led us to the confusion of here and now. I agree that everyone is to blame for continued confusion, with miscommunication about FNAF stories going as far as driving fans away. That's okay though, mysteries such as these aren't for everyone. I would also agree that mystery stories need to be crafted properly in order to work, and that not every last little detail has to mean something. However, regarding the bread story, Mr. Hippo says a story is just a story, so shut up and eat your sandwich. I take issue with this for two reasons. Number one, it sort of contradicts what Mr. Hippo said in the tea story. Mr. Hippo announces that he has a story, but when Orville responds with, "What's the significance of the story?" instead of recognizing this as a mistake and emphasizing that stories must have meaning and value exactly like he did before, he backtracks and makes a conflicting argument that stories don't have to have significance. This vague comeback of a story is just a story and a belittling order like that of a frustrated parent to a petulant child, quite frankly, feels offensive. Is this supposed to be Scott talking to the fans? Please tell me it's a joke if so. Otherwise, what am I supposed to take out of this? That Scott is deliberately making as many excuses as he can for FNAF's poor storytelling? Was this a test? Did he deliberately have one contradicting argument in Mr. Hippo's ramblings to show us that some things, like this particular point, mean nothing? Did Mr. Hippo simply get too much sun that time? I don't expect perfection, but this feels needlessly defensive. Hopefully I'm just overanalyzing it. Number two, as I said earlier, overanalyzing and overthinking FNAF was how we got here in the first place. While I think relying on the novels for game plot points and the endless retconning and rewriting of FNAF 4 were mistakes, part of FNAF's unique charm is digging deep to find clues to the true lore of the universe to build characters and events in a fun way. It allows for creativity and problem solving at the same time, putting together smaller pieces into a bigger whole that is very satisfying to do. To have the very creator of this franchise tell me that the most unique and enjoyable thing I do with it is a foolish endeavor is disheartening, to put it politely. This franchise was built on mystery from its very first day, and while that is allowed to change, Scott can do what he wants with FNAF, the issue is with the storytelling. If there are widespread falsehoods about FNAF, it's the responsibility of the writer to clear those up. If not everything has to mean something, then what does mean something? How are we supposed to differentiate between what does and does not mean anything? Where do we draw the line between a lore clue that adds to the lore and a simple meaningless reference or callback? How much of, say, Fazbear Fright's explanations of haunting and possession, or Afton family allegories, is just referencing sister location, or actually trying to clue us in on a hint about the original game's lore? Is Help Wanted's Malhare model literally what the original Spring Bonnie costume looked like back at Fredbear's, or is it just a model that Steelwool made for the glitch for their game because they modeled it? There's no consistent pattern, and I've tried to find the place to draw that line, but I cannot consistently draw it across all FNAF media. It's just too disorganized. I think I speak for all of us when I say I would honestly rather blunt, clunky explanations of what is going on from r/animdude just telling us, rather than these endlessly vague hints scattered across books and websites. I'm tired of it, Scott. We are all so very, very tired. This finally brings me to the ultimate point of this video. Years ago, I analysed and evaluated these stories, but with this video, it's only now that I truly realise some of the messages, potential interpretations, and meanings in a 2022 context. I've even formed my own opinions on this, looking back on them deeply for the first time in years. Now, this argument is founded on things you may disagree with, things that I may have misinterpreted, but it honestly seems to me that these stories are more relevant than ever because of how much they have been ignored, or worse, twisted interpretation-wise to make excuses for, yes, that's right, security breach. As someone with respect for the integrity of FNAF as a franchise, and not as a long-time fan, it doesn't matter how long you've been a fan, the Afton ending and the overall total lack of engaging characters, plot, mystery, etc., it was agonizing to see. This game could ruin FNAF for me, but I choose to ignore its existence Usually. See, Security Breach was a 3D free-roam adventure game on a larger scale. It should have been more like Outlast, Resident Evil, Subnautica, Soma, Dying Light, Bioshock, Portal 2, or even Bendy and the f***ing Ink Machine, for crying out loud. With tons of dialogue in real time, with fully detailed humans in what I presume is the real world, until there's another stupid plot twist that it was all a dream or a game inside a game. That mysterious, implicit style of storytelling from the older FNaF games does not work. Subnautica probably comes the closest to making the implicit storytelling style work, since it has a silent protagonist who picks up audio logs on his travels. The gameplay, like FNAF's, is just the resulting consequence of actions from the past, although, unlike FNAF, the player does actually have agency to progress a present-time plot too. Like Undertale, this works because the player can project their own personality into the protagonist and interpret it however they would like. One of my many critiques of Bendy, or should I say more specifically Batim, is that it doesn't choose whether to have a protagonist fully open to interpretation, nor does it provide a nuanced and developed personality with a real drive, motives, fears, personality traits. It waddles a mediocre middle ground, leaving Henry Stein quite unmemorable. I can't describe his personality very well because it just changes to suit the plot. Gregory, however, makes Henry look as nuanced as Kyle Crane or Leon Kennedy. He is even more bland, and he doesn't even have a motive or reason to even exist. Not every detail has to have meaning, yes, but some do. Stories must have value or purpose, and that means not spinning out random details without actually having a story to tell. If there's no intent under the surface, and the scattered mysteries are simply there for their own sake, so that players and fandoms are forced to come up with a story for the developers since they're too lazy to write anything coherent or meaningful, then that is abject failure of storytelling and art. Throwing in random connections to other events and media doesn't make for good world building or storytelling. It has to be done with thought and reason. If anything, lacking that will offend the very fans you're trying to pander to. Dying Light 2 and Subnautica Below Zero handled this by telling a completely fresh and new story in the same world, separated by time and geography, with minor callbacks to their respective originals' events. This prevents ruining satisfying character arcs or trivializing events and concepts that made the franchises previously so unique. Portal 2 never randomly brings in references and ties to the first game, Doug Ratman, Aperture as a whole. The callbacks are selective and they are placed with care and intent. Even in connection with the Half-Life series, it respects the established universe and continuity and avoids bringing in Gordon Freeman or the Vortigons at random for fan service. Imagine if Bending in the Dark Revival randomly brought Susie Campbell back to life with the exact same personality as Chapter 3 Alice Angel with watered down motives for the sake of something familiar for old fans. It'd be garbage. And yet, for all the flaws of these games, not a single one of them, not even Bendy, fails as fundamentally a security breach. It all goes against the very lessons Mr. Hippo is trying to teach us. If you announce that you have a story, make sure it's worthwhile. If there is miscommunication, don't blame your fanbase, don't blame yourself, just do what needs to be done to clarify and rectify issues with sense and respect to the very people who enabled your success. And still, Corthan remains totally silent on Reddit, and Steelwall has nothing to say other than whatever this is. Trust me, I am well aware of how the stories could be twisted to argue against what I'm saying. Mr. Hippo does blame Orville for continually misunderstanding him. Scott may very well argue that Security Breach's lack of explanation of anything makes it intriguing to investigate. Even FNAFers themselves may point out, well, a story doesn't have to mean anything crazy, it can just be a story, and that I'm taking too many details too seriously or too literally, all in opposition to the true meaning of these messages. To those people who weren't convinced by everything I've been saying the last however long of this video, what makes a good story then? What was so compelling about the plot of Security Breach? How and why did these characters develop? What did you learn from it? Security Breach didn't even have a flawed story I could invest myself in and critique. I would honestly rather argue about FNAF 4, and I hate doing that. It always ends in tears. SB was hollow and soulless. I wasn't expecting a masterpiece. It didn't need to be fantastic, just something I can actually talk about and engage with. Is having absolutely no coherent plot or character development somehow better than a bad hit and miss one? Alright, I'm gonna drop this. I think I've said everything that I wanted to, so that's the end of the video. But I thought it was worth adding that rant about security breach onto the end of this video because it's relevant. All support would be appreciated, like, share, subscribe, and all that crap. I don't have a community tab yet, so until I'm at 500 subscribers, join the Discord. I look forward to all the discussion about Mr Hippo's stories and all of my terrible, controversial takes. But for now, subscribe and speculate. What would FNaF be like if Scott hadn't emphasized the lore elements?